In this tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to open up a door based off of walking on a trigger volume inside of Unreal Engine 5. This is going to be an easy to follow tutorial that is going to take us inside of C++ to do some coding. So let's get started. The basic idea we're running with is we're going to create a float curve object that's going to represent our door's opening rotation over time. Using this curve as a reference, we're going to be able to make it so that our door open and closes whenever we trigger a hidden event near the door. Full disclaimer, I learned this approach by following a written tutorial I found online. I will leave a link to the original tutorial down in the description. Let's start by building that float curve. We're going to create a new object inside of the miscellaneous section that is called the curve object. We're going to use the subtype curve float, and we're going to create that object, and I'm going to call this my door opening rotation. So this is where we're going to be able to create a simple graph that we're going to be able to run through. Basically, the X value represents time and the Y value represents the value that you want to care about. In our case, the rotation of our door as it's opening. So if we right click, we can add a key, and that is going to set a key point on our graph. And the moment you add a key, you're going to be able to set the specific values here at the top in case you're not very specific interacting with the graph. So in this case, I want our first point to be at time 0 and rotation value 0. If I right click and add another key, well, in this case, I'm gonna have this happen at time 3, let's say, and we're gonna make this go to 90 degrees. Now, inside of the graph, you can hit Control A, and that will select all of your points that you've created. And with all those points selected, you can hit Hotkey F, and that's going to show you your entire selection. So now you can see visually really what we're looking for here. And that is some variable that's going to go from 0 to 90 degrees when we trigger a certain event. We're gonna go and we're gonna create this to make it a little more curvy so that it's not so flat here. To do that, since we have all of our points selected, we're gonna go to the top here and we're going to press on this cubic interpolation to use flat tangents. With that selected, you can see this creates a much more curvy curve. So keep this curve in mind as we go forward, because whenever we hit play on this specific object, this is going to move through time, and this rotation that we're going to assign is going to increase. So we can save that object, and now we can go into our C++ classes. Let's create a new C++ class of type actor, since we're going to be putting it in the world. And I'm going to call this door, and we can create that. Now, with that open, let's go into our header file and let's set up everything that we're going to be doing. First, we're going to include another file. It's important that this goes between this game framework and the door. I have found that if you're ever including an include after this name.generated, issues can occur. So make sure you place this timeline component in between. And I'll explain this timeline component more when we get to it. Now let's talk the code we're going to need. This is all of the code that we're going to use throughout this tutorial. Let's go through it. Starting in this public section up here, we have one new property. It's a U property so that we can edit it in blueprints, and we're going to be able to edit this anywhere because this is a representation of that float that we created before. We're going to use this float to set our rotation of the door. Into the private section, we are going to have two meshes. One mesh is for the door frame, and another is for the door itself. Next is this timeline component, and this timeline component is specifically what's going to allow us to animate our door in space. And then our final component here is a box component, which is going to be our proximity volume, which is going to tell us when we should start opening and when we should start closing our door based off of our curve. We're going to have one variable here of type onTimelineFloat. This is going to interact with our curve so that we can take the value that is present inside of our curve and then use it in code. And then we're going to have three functions here. All of these need to be marked as U function. The first is going to be responsible for the actual update of our rotation in space based off of the value that our float curve is providing. And then we have our two overlaps, one where the overlap begins and one where the overlap ends. So that's at a glance what we're going to do. Let's actually implement the thing now. Inside of our C++ file, let's start chipping away. First, to make our code happy, we're going to include our box component, since that's something that we forward declared and we're going to need to use it here. Next, we're going to go into our constructor and we're going to set up all of our components. I've gone through this a lot in other tutorials. Make sure you just create each component for use later. Next is begin play. Inside of begin play, we're doing a few complicated things. First, we're taking this update function float, which from our header file, we remember is an fonTimeline float, and we are binding this float to be the variable responsible inside of our update timeline component function. So that means whatever number is present on our timeline will be the input of our update timeline component, which, if we remember from our header file, is taking in a float called the output. This is the output from our update function float. These two are going to be connected because of this line of code. Next, we're going to make sure that we actually gave ourselves a timeline to work with. Again, this is a representation of that curve we made earlier in the tutorial. Assuming we remember to populate our curve inside of our object, then we're going to call a function called interpfloat. This basically allows us to change the value over time. And we are going to be assigning the value off of our float curve to the update function float. So to go over this one more time, if we have a float curve to work with, our timeline component is going to create a relationship between our float curve and our function float. This function float is bound to the input of our actual updating timeline component. And spoiler alert for what we're about to do next, this update timeline component function is going to be what changes the rotation of our door. And to now do that next thing inside of the header file, I'm going to hit Alt and Enter to create a definition of the update timeline component within my C++ file. I just hinted at the goal of this function, and here is the code that we're going to need. Based off of our knowledge on what our curve is going to do, we are going to create an F rotator that is going to be our new rotation. This rotator is going to take the output that is being given to us by our curve, by this line of code from our begin play method. And then after this is created, we are going to make sure that our door, which is the actual door that needs to swing open, is going to take in our new rotation. Why do we know to use the y-axis? Let's take a look at any old cube here, and let's use the E shortcut here to go into the rotator. If we look on the right-hand side, we'll be able to see either the X, the Y, or the Z rotation as we go through these. Basically, we want to have our door swing open like this. This looks like it's responsible by the Z axis here, but this is actually the roll value. And for whatever reason, since we can't have nice things, the roll value here is not in the same position as the way we would define the roll inside of code. A rotator always goes roll, pitch, and yaw. We can see here when I hover over this that is true. For whatever reason, inside of the actual Unreal Engine, it displays them in a different order. But regardless, we now have a relationship where whenever we have our timeline updating, we are going to assign that to our door's rotation to make it look like it's opening. The last thing we have to do in code is our begin and end overlap. So I'm just going to create both of those methods at the same time, since they're both going to be rather simplistic for us to do. When our overlap begins, we are going to want to play through our curve. We're going to want to start moving through time on our curve. To do that, we're going to take our timeline component and we're going to hit play on it. And on overlap end, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to reverse through time whenever we leave that overlapping area. And that's everything we need to do. So let's save here, and then we're going to go compile. With a successful compile, I'm going to right click on my door and I'm going to create a blueprint class based off of this. I'm going to shove it in content, and leaving it as my door is fine with me. Open it up, and now we can create our actual object. Starting with our door frame, if we go into the static mesh and look for something called door, you're going to see that you have a series of static meshes to work with, assuming that you have the starter content. So there is our door frame. Now inside of our door mesh, I'm going to go and do the same thing. I'll search for door, and we're going to need the actual door. Now looking at this, let's line this up. So I'm going to use hotkey W, and I'm going to move this so that it is in line with our door frame. If you're having a little bit of difficulty, go up to the top here. And then you're going to turn off snapping for dragging objects around, and that's going to allow you to zoom in, get nice and close, and allow you to just snap that into place. If I go and look, that seems pretty okay to me. Then we can go into our proximity volume, and we're going to set up where our trigger is. I'm going to keep things pretty much where exactly it is. I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger so that it's easier to trigger in the world. And then that last thing we need to do, we're going to go to the root here, my door self, and we need to assign that float curve to be the curve that we made earlier. And if you remember, we called this the door opening rotation curve. With that all done, we can compile and save this blueprint here. And let's drag this into the world. Now that's a little small, that's fine. I'm going to use hotkey R, and I'm going to make this much bigger. So let's hit play and let's go see what's going on. When I approach our door, we hit that trigger volume and our door opens because our curve has gone from 0 to 90. When I leave this magical cube, it closes because we are now playing in reverse. This even happens if I happen to interrupt it partway in between. And what's really interesting is you can take some liberty here by adjusting the curve. If I go and click on my last point here, let's say I change this to be over 1 second instead of over 3 seconds. And let's say that instead of going from 90 degrees, I want to go all the way to 180 degrees. That's obviously going to change our curve a fair bit, but let's save that and see the difference here. When I go and hit play now and I go and hit that trigger volume, you can see it flies open. So this gives you a lot of customizability by using these curves. Congratulations, now you know how to open a door inside of Unreal Engine. This approach of using a curve to control attributes on an object is something that I have been using across different functions as I've been continuing to learn more about the engine. So I hope you found this helpful, and you can see the potential for applications.